Everybody, welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday. We are the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
I'm John Kennedy.
And today we have a case of the 5 R's. We have rejected, rebuked, revelation, recipients, and rewards. We're taking a look at the gospel according to Matthew chapter 11, verses 16 to 19 and verses 25 to 30. Jesus said to the crowd, "To what will I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to one another. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. And the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds." At that time Jesus said, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent, and you have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light."
You want to take the first crack, John?
Sure. I suppose we could begin just with a bit of context, where this story fits in, and it falls within the narrative of Matthew that we've been walking through in ordinary time thus far. This is launching us into another section, at least as it's been designated, identified by scholars of Matthew's gospel. Our last few Sundays, we were looking at passages that fell within Jesus' mission in Galilee, if I'm correct about that. And now we're moving on to what's known as his questioning, and the questioning he faces and the opposition he faces from religious authorities. And so we see this certainly in this passage. Jesus is talking about the way that not only he has been received and responded to by his contemporaries, but also the way that John the Baptist has been responded to. And Jesus is basically saying that God has sent both John and himself to bring a divine word, sent them on a divine mission, but their own people do not understand, do not receive them, which of course echoes the Gospel of John, which is one of several echoes of John's Gospel in this passage. But anyway, that's what Jesus is speaking to here. John the Baptist at this point is in prison, and he sent some of his people to go to Jesus' people and say, is this guy the Messiah or not? Presumably because I'm in jail, and that's not what's supposed to happen when the Messiah comes, perhaps. And Jesus is saying, in words that we don't actually get in this particular passage, but in very nearby verses, that indeed I am the Messiah, in so many words. And yet our own people, both John's people and Jesus' people, aren't getting it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You had some R's. Can you recap
I got all
the 5
my
R's?
You guys
I was
want my
impressed
R's
by
again?
that.
I'm impressed by my R's too. I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning to study this, and I came up with the 5 R's. So rejected. Jesus is rejected. That's what's happening here. Chapters 11 to 13 in Matthew is all this rejection that he goes through. And what does he do? He rebukes those who reject him. And he just, bam, that's what you were just speaking to. And then he talks about revelation, himself as the revelation. And this is where we get the Johannine work that you were talking about. I'm in the Father, and the Father's in the Son, and I'm the one who can reveal God to you. Then he talks about the recipients. Who is it that can receive what his teaching is? Yeah. And we get that as not the intellectuals, but those who are humble of heart. And then we get the rewards. What do you get? And the yoke is easy and the burden is light. I'll give rest for your souls. Really, so those are my 5 R's that I came up after getting up at 5 o'clock this morning.
And that's a wrap. That's pretty good. I'm impressed. That's incredible. It's very helpful, actually, to structure this out that way. I hadn't thought of that or seen it jump off the page.
Yeah, neither did I. Actually, I looked at, like, do I have the right passage? I was hearing the 5
I
R's,
know.
but
I was
it's
looking
all
for
in
R
there.
words in the
really
text.
in there. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think
That's really
there's
helpful,
some
actually.
interesting pieces that where we might talk about here just
Yeah.
as we launch in. I mean, one is certainly we're used to Jesus being rejected, and we've just gotten done with chapter 10 where he's telling all the apostles they're going to be rejected, and to my Sunday sermon that Jesus isn't nice. Those of you who heard my Sunday sermon, he's rebuking those who. But let's get into the revelation piece, the piece that sounds like John, where he basically says, "I'm the only guy that can reveal God to you."
He totally says that.
That's what he says.
Outright, yeah.
Outright.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
I'm the guy. You want to know the unseen God? Look at me. It's a tall claim.
It's another out loud prayer, too. I mean, I think this one passes us by sometimes when we're looking at
That's right.
the what do you call it? The Jesus prayer, Father, I think, from John.
Yeah, high priestly prayer.
High priestly prayer.
That's
so
right.
here he's doing
It
it
is
again in Matthew. I hadn't really.
Very much in that
convinced it.
vein.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll add an R. Well, it's off the topic of Revelation, so maybe in a minute I will. But
Yeah, so I just want to say, when Jesus, breaks that piece down, if you don't mind my going in pulling that up here, and when he says, all things have been handed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son. I think those little phrases are incredible. So Jesus is saying, nobody knows me. All I could think of was, somebody going through a process of individuation into adulthood and saying to his or her parents, "You have no idea who I am," kind of thing. And Jesus is saying, "You don't actually know me. Only the Father really knows me." And then that statement that no one knows the Father except the Son, which is this is the claim of Christian revelation as different than, because the gospel according to Matthew is so Hebrew centric, and it really is the law taken in some sense refashioned by Jesus, and the difference being Jesus' interpretation of that. And then he makes the basis for that reinterpretation is to say, I actually know what God is like. And so therefore the law should be fashioned in this way, understood in this way.
right. And then whenever I see the word knows or knowledge or something like that in these Gospels, I always think that's much more than, I mean, you've talked about this, the intellectual knowledge versus the gnosis, knowledge of the heart. I feel like the word can be so expansive here that God actually, it's to love and receive and move into, kind of abide with, and all that sort of connotation. And he's speaking out loud in this stage whisper, at least it's implied, and he's speaking to this crowd. I mean, it's within earshot. So and all these people who've been condemning John for having a demon, they suppose, and condemning Jesus for being a glutton and a drunkard. And I think he's pointing out that, all you who think you know everything don't really know what's right before your eyes. And so anyway, I think maybe that's a little obvious, but I think it's worth stopping to reflect on a little bit. Because he's, this weird, now I'll add my R, which is role playing. Because I think here in these, in this weird verse, we played the flute for you and you did not dance. We wailed and you did not mourn. Jesus is comparing this generation to these children sitting in the marketplace and calling to one another. And I know you guys have read these commentaries too, but they talk about this being a reference to a game, like a child's game, mimicking the adult world of singers at weddings, who are usually the men, singing and dancing at weddings, and then the children and the women would wail and mourn at funerals, and those were their designated roles in these rituals. And so there's some passage in Ecclesiastes where children are playing these games, and the children aren't cooperating with one another, and they're sort of calling each other out. We're playing the flute and you're not dancing, We're wailing and you're not mourning. And Jesus is comparing the generation, like you're like these children sitting in the marketplace, just calling each other out. You're not like us. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. wah, wah, wah,
Yeah.
And I think that it's helpful to me to realize that he's actually referencing something in their culture there, because it doesn't make sense in our culture.
Yeah.
I actually didn't read that in the commentary. That was news to me. Yeah, that's
I
cool.
didn't read all that. I got the children's game part, but not all the connections to
I didn't.
mimicking wedding and funeral
Yeah.
practices. That's really interesting.
So they're preparing, for their, which obviously for me connects to the Girardian idea that these are
Right.
ritual, kind of at least ritual sacrifice culture, where, at a funeral, everyone has their role, everyone's got their place, and it's all these us and them kind of games that they are playing. And I think Jesus is referencing that in some way.
Yeah. I think that role-playing, sixth R, is so interesting because to me it fits in a really fascinating way to a question that I have about this text and the dynamics of it, which is, Jesus faces opposition from a number of parties, but one of them is the Pharisees, who are presumably a very sincere group of people. And they, at least as they're depicted in the Gospels, certainly not a fan of Jesus in general terms, and seemingly not really a fan of John the Baptist either. And yet Jesus and John the Baptist, as this passage tells us, are approaching their divine mission and presentation of God's word and so on in very different ways. John is, full on ascetic in the wilderness, locusts and wild honey, shouting at people, basically, telling them that the axe is already at the base of the tree.
Right. You brood of vipers.
Right. People who come to him to check him out, his greeting words are, "You brood of vipers." Jesus, and John doesn't drink, he doesn't party, he doesn't really socialize, probably.
Hanging with John sounds like a great time.
Yeah. Jesus is much different. He eats, he drinks, he parties. He has pointed words, but probably not quite as pointed as John. Although, anyway, we just moved out of some of Matthew where that could have been John the Baptist talking about the end of the world. But either way, John's the caricature of John is, he's so austere and extreme that he has a demon, and the caricature of Jesus is that, look, he hangs out with the wrong people and drinks and stuff like that. So neither is received, even though they're so different in their approach. But what's probably not disputable is their sincerity and their charisma, and that they have something driving them, something animating them, and something that's clearly landing with a broad base of people. So what is it about both of them that isn't getting through to, let's say, the Pharisees? This group of people who, by keeping the commandments as they understand them, the written oral Torah, are trying to be righteous, and therefore, literally be right with God. And role-playing, I think, is an interesting thing. I mean, Jesus and John are both like cutting right to the heart of reality. If you really listen to their message, they don't leave any hiding place for the ego and the various games it plays. And certainly looking at the Pharisees in a Christian lens, I mean, it's a classic sort of works righteousness thing, trying to earn your salvation, which is really another way of just bolstering the ego. And perhaps it's a piety that ends up being more about me than about God, even if that's not consciously known. Now, whether or not that applies to all the Pharisees, it certainly applies to a lot of religious folks, past, present, and no doubt future, including, probably all of us at various times. So it's not about pointing the finger at the Pharisees or any other group. But what Jesus and John leave no place for is sort of role-playing before God, which is a real challenge, certainly to me, I think to all of us. And connects to the Christology here. Nobody knows the Father except the Son. Nobody knows the Son except the Father. Reminding us that despite all the teaching that Jesus does in Matthew's Gospel, the point isn't the teaching. The point is Jesus.
Really interesting, John. I mean, the whole question here about wisdom is vindicated by her deeds, all of which is to say that it doesn't matter if you reject us. It's clear by the charism that's been given to us by God that that we have the right stuff, and so it doesn't matter what you say. The naysayers are not going to win the day. Is really what he's saying there. And it's interesting about the question of wisdom and these teachers and the yoke. We get into the whole question of the yoke. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. And I mean, speaking of commentaries, you guys all know that we tend to think of the yoke as a heavy, burdensome thing, but in the Hebrew day, the yoke was not a heavy, burdensome thing. That was in Hebrew teachings, the yoke is a joyful thing, and it's the yoke of the law, it's the yoke of the kingdom, and it's the thing that guides you in life. And so, and the burden, the heavy laden, is not only just the emotions of life, but it's, Jesus is he's entering into a conversation and saying, my yoke, the teachings that I understand as the wisdom teacher, these are less burdensome than the yoke of, we'll just say the yoke of Moses, as you understand the yoke of Moses, or the yoke of Sirach, or the yoke of wisdom, as you understand the yoke of wisdom, and that, and then you get into that whole question about yokes are, the wooden thing they put around the ox, the beast of burden, but those yokes are carved to fit each animal. And so the yoke of Jesus's wisdom teachings are those that we can bear, easily, and that they will give us rest. That's an incredibly evocative thing.
Right.
Indeed,
Jesus takes these guys on,
right.
But he takes them on in the language that they would all have known.
Yeah. The connotation here is totally transformed. That the yoke is something to ease your burden, not put the burden on you.
Right.
And I think in the Old Testament, the yoke, the idea of the yoke was to yoke yourself to the law and study day and night, and that was the righteousness path, and it brought joy. And it, as you said, it was a joyful thing. And this idea of easy, that word can be translated in the Greek to kindness and gentleness and all that.
Yeah, it also does well-fitting is another way that can be.
That's
nice.
And also this connectedness idea that, we don't go it alone. The yoke connected the ox to the farmer or whatever, or to another ox sometimes. And, we can't really be guided through life just aimlessly wandering,
Indeed.
Love the idea of someone pulling me one way or the other that knows where I should go.
And also in that yoke, you get that whole question of like learning, speaking of the rabbis and the studying, and Jesus as rabbi, wisdom teacher, but not just as rabbi, wisdom teacher. He is Son of God and incarnate wisdom and incarnate all of this stuff. And so it's very interesting to me, but we're still, as you've pointed out in previous podcasts, Elizabeth, that we are talking about Jesus as teacher, and we are to learn, and we are to love the learning of what he has to say to us.
Indeed.
Yeah, I love that phrase, and learn from me. I mean, it doesn't say do what I say, or just, do as I do. It doesn't even say that. It just is, he's talking about learning, which I love.
Yeah.
Really
yeah,
helpful.
indeed. Yeah, right. Teachings and the rabbi all come together here, and I love the yoke imagery, because the yoke is, as we said in the Hebrew Bible, yoke is talked about in terms of Torah, taking the Torah upon you, and certainly Jesus's time, there were different rabbis around, and their followers were said to have taken the yoke of that rabbi upon them. So the teaching absolutely matters. I sort of said, probably drew up a false dichotomy between teachings and Jesus himself. But certainly, the person of Jesus comes first, and following his teachings flow out of your connectedness to Jesus, having really taken his yoke upon you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing, again, it's amazing what happens if you can't sleep and you get up and you start studying this stuff. I also read and heard an incredible thing this morning about a book written by a contemporary rabbi, a rabbinical scholar, and he read the New Testament. He read the Gospels as though he were following Jesus around, and then he wrote a book as though he went to see somebody, another rabbi, and the other rabbi said to him, "Well, what do you think?" and his, and I think the question was, what did Jesus leave out from the essentials of the law? And he said, nothing. And then the rabbi said, what did he add? And the response was, himself.
Wow.
I know.
That's
wow. And so to look at that lens, because we were talking about, this is a Jewish story here, right? This is a Hebrew story. And that Jesus adding himself makes that yoke differently, and it puts a personal relationship with Jesus at the center of the way we understand and live out our relationship with God, with the divine. And that is a categorical difference from our Hebrew brothers and sisters who have many, so much of the same underpinnings of the faith. I mean, the summary of the law and all this, and we're talking about rabbis here. And so Jesus has a very big difference. And, to contend with him and then his contention of what Jesus says about himself.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it really speaks to the cosmic nature of the incarnation and of Jesus being present to reveal our human ways, to us. And he's so much bigger than one tradition or one faith. And obviously he was Jewish. So I wouldn't discount that. I mean, I would never discount that. But when I read this passage, I think of all the ways that groups, humans tie themselves to cultural laws, quote unquote, the expectations of society or their group or their family. It's such people are weary and carrying the heavy burdens of their lives in all the circles that we move in. And it doesn't matter if it's religion or work or social or teenage expectations or whatever it is. The idea that a yoke wouldn't be something heavy on you, but that it would actually alleviate your burden and free you from all that is an incredible overturning of the word and the concept. And he kept to his laws in the most beautiful way because he infuses them with himself, which I think is the embodied love of the divine, that we just can't recognize, even though it's right in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, what a mix this guy's all about. I mean, that he does transcend every tribe and every other teacher. And then he says basically, I am gentle and humble of heart. And we get, blessed are the meek. From a teachings a few chapters earlier, and he comes on a foal of a donkey, and the whole suffering servant thing. And yet the burden that my burden is easy. It's not to say Jesus isn't demanding.
Yeah, see chapter 10. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
The last 3 podcasts.
I know.
Yeah,
it's
whiplash.
Which part about it this is easy?
True.
And light.
Whiplash.
Yeah. I mean, C.S. Lewis said that Christianity is much harder and easier than basically, anybody, understands, or much harder and easier than conventionally understood.
Yeah.
Both by Christians and people of other religious traditions, just people generally thinking about, what does this involve? And, so often, following Jesus or becoming Christian or rededicating yourself to one's faith is thought about perhaps by oneself or by others looking on at this, person seeking to deepen their life of faith is like, okay, so I'm John. I like to drive my car and play golf and play guitar, and I don't like to play golf that much, but my dad really does. I'm not really trying to be autobiographical. I'm just giving a list of things like what one might like to do, and I like to, ride my bike and do my job and spend time with my family. And then there's this thing, Christianity, that I'm supposed to layer on here, right. Part of my
Sundays.
wellness routine or something, carve out a little time for my Christianity, a little time for my spirituality. Right. I hope I have time for it today.
Your healthy shake.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's not at all what Jesus is interested in. Jesus is not interested in being an add-on or a plug-in.
Right.
Jesus is asking for all of us to be totally handed over to him, right? Not just to his Father, because he and the Father are like this. Right. So it's right. He adds himself to the Torah. He adds himself to his tradition,
which you can do in your push-ups and on your bike and with your family,
right?
And
so it's like
eating and drinking,
right? So easier and harder. It's amazing. And in chapter 10, he says all sorts of really tough things, including if you do not take up your cross and follow me, you're not worthy to be my disciple. And, if you deny me before others, I will deny you before my Father. And yet here he's saying, I am gentle and humble in heart, and I will give you rest for your souls. So, we can't really grab a hold of this guy. As Peter, you have said so many times in your preaching here, he is, which is to me one of like the proofs, if you will, that like this is the real deal, because like you can't pin this guy down. He defies categories.
He does, but the cool thing is he grabs a hold of you. I mean, that's the thing.
Yes,
that's the thing.
That is the thing.
Because none of us. I mean, we're 102 podcasts in, and we're still flailing away trying to get a handle on this guy.
Yeah. Maybe we should just give up.
Yeah.
Give over.
You can't give up because he's got a hold of you.
Yeah, right.
That's the thing.
That's another
that's
thing.
The thing. Is he
that's
just,
another thing.
That's the yoke. You're in the yoke. You're in the yoke.
Yeah.
So we're coming toward the end here. Anybody with a final word here?
The only thing I think we could say a little bit more about is how Matthew is bringing in this divine wisdom. I know we've touched on it, but maybe not as explicitly as we could, because I don't know if it comes up so much in Matthew anywhere else. I mean, Matthew is all about Jesus as the Messiah, just as the New Testament is. But here in this chapter, clearly Matthew is consciously, deliberately drawing upon not only the Old Testament archetype, if you will, of the Messiah, but also that of divine wisdom. So this adds another facet to who Jesus is. Right. He's not just, the son of David to restore, the people of God, but he's divine wisdom, the one who is with God from the beginning, the one who teaches. So back to teaching. Right. And we've already talked about teaching, but just to say that there's a wealth of Old Testament resonances here, from Proverbs, from Sirach, which is a book in our Apocrypha. It's in the Roman Catholic Old Testament. And that there's this, there are many verses about wisdom speaking, divine wisdom personified, always as feminine, which is really, really significant here, especially in all this language about son and father, that there clearly is a feminine valence to who Jesus is. But, come to me, this is from Sirach, just one example of many from the Hebrew Scriptures. You who desire me and eat your fill of my fruits, draw near to me, you who are uneducated. So this is like, Jesus being revealed to those who are lowly, and lodge in the house of instruction. I mean, that's almost the same thing.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah, so total continuity with the Hebrew tradition, but with a part of that tradition that isn't always foregrounded, I think, in our understanding of what the New Testament says about Jesus.
Yeah, well, when you think about John calling Jesus the Logos,
exactly.
Here he's really referencing himself as the wisdom, right? Just what you read, it seems almost verbatim.
Yeah.
So much of this stuff, again, we've said this over and over and over. I mean, this is a many-layered story, and the more you know, the more you know, and the more you get. And now we're talking about, Sirach, and where the words are almost the same, I mean, with some different emphasis on syllables that change its meaning somewhat. And also, hey, the same thing is true for the passage we just moved over, where a lot of that, and I will give you rest, that's Jeremiah 6:16 or something like that. I mean, these words from Jeremiah are almost exactly the same too. So Jesus is picking up that tradition and bending and moving these things. Many layered beauty is what this thing is.
And as much as we talk about Jesus himself, as the main, the thing, I don't think we get to himself through his teachings. I mean, for me personally, especially in Matthew, it's the consummate teaching gospel, even though the emphasis is on who he is. I don't think that we're at a point in our human species existence where we can just bypass the teachings to get to himself. I mean, I think we need that avenue.
100%.
And we're not even close to really grasping it, the teachings.
Oh, that's for sure. That's for sure. I mean, you take a look at so many of Jesus's teachings that are super hard to grasp. Do not judge.
Right.
Grab a hold of that one.
Forgive.
Yeah. Forgive 70 times 70. Love your enemy. Forgive those who, pray for those who hate you. Turn the other cheek. I mean, this guy's got a lot of stuff in here that's very, very difficult to.
So difficult.
Difficult.
Yeah.
Well, I just have to say that we are grateful to all of you for joining us in our podcast, and we're grateful for each other as we all, wrestle with our Lord's teachings, which is exactly what we're doing here, in seeing how Jesus lives out his life and how he teaches his disciples about his life, and the story keeps rolling. Right? The Acts of the Apostles is the first history, the only history in the New Testament, and we're all the Acts of the Apostles. We're all trying to live this out. And so we appreciate those of you who are paying attention to the gospel along with us, and we ask that you subscribe to our stuff and you share it with your friends, and maybe someday before the eschaton we'll get to 1,000 followers, and that'll give us more freedom to do more things with the podcast. So God bless you. Thank you for tuning in. See you again.